All right, shall we, Andrew? Ready?
As ready as I'll ever be.
All right, a very good evening to all of you. Thank you for coming. Really appreciate that at this time of the day for our book launch. My name is Lutz Oette. I'm the co-director of the SOAS Center for Human Rights Law, together with Dr. Staggs Kelsall, who I will introduce in a minute. It's our great pleasure to be here with Andrew Jefferson, the co-editor of the book we're going to launch at SOAS today, Everyday Prison Governance in Myanmar. It's a tremendous book for those of you who haven't had the opportunity to look at it yet. It's the first in-depth, empirically based, systematic study of imprisonment practice in Myanmar between 2015 to 2020, a period believed by many at the time to herald a new democratic dawn for Myanmar, an illusion which was shattered by the military coup of February 2021. And it has many, many lessons, especially for someone like me, I guess Michelle as well, who come from a human rights law background, to see an ethnographic approach that takes a very different view of prisons and prison life. And that makes it even more fascinating, I think, for the lawyers in the room to hear these perspectives and to be in conversation with you and in dialogue. And we really thank you for having chosen us as the one who then launched the book here at SOAS in London. I think it's the only launch in London, isn't it, that you're having? Right. Very good. So let me briefly introduce Andrew to you. He's a senior researcher at Dignity, the Danish Institute Against Torture, a very well-known organization in the field that really stands out for the empirical research that is done on the ground, and obviously Andrew's work really epitomizes that. And over the last 2 decades, he has focused on prisons in the Global South, the effects of imprisonment, and the relationship between confinement and subjectivity. So if you really want to find out from close up what prison life in the Global South is like and all the dynamics, then I direct you to the number of publications that Andrew has produced over the years. He is also, he told me intriguingly, here in London right now on Reconnaissance for New project on confinement, migration, marginality and degrees of freedom among members of this Sierra Leonean diaspora. So I hope that is going as well as planned. And last but not least, Andrew told us that he's currently reinventing himself as a scholar of joy and exuberance, so which is quite a challenge, I guess, when we look at the subjects you cover. So obviously we wish you all the best and look forward that some of that will rub off on all of us in the process. So Andrew will be the main speaker for about 20 minutes or so, and then introducing the book and giving Michelle then the chance to act as a discussant, to first comment on it for around 10 minutes or so, then be in conversation with Andrew, and then we'll open it for question and answer. Before I hand over to Andrew, let me briefly introduce Michelle, Dr. Michelle Staggs Kelsall, my dear co-director and colleague here at SOAS, a senior lecturer in international law who joined SOAS after decades of working with the United Nations and research organizations, so really a practitioner becoming academic, with lots of experience in the region as well. She has worked as head of the Rule of Law Unit at the Office of the UN Human Rights in Cambodia, and the Deputy Director of the Human Rights Resource Center for ASEAN, where she oversaw all of the center's research, training and outreach initiatives, including engaging with prison reform in Cambodia and multi-country studies on the rule of law, freedom of religion and trafficking in persons. So in the course of her work, she's also focused on Myanmar, and also although her recent work and scholarship has a more global dimension, she plans to return and shift her focus, at least partially, to Southeast Asia again, looking at corporate human rights harms in Indonesia and social solidarity movements seeking to prevent this, because one important strand of Michelle's scholarship is on business and human rights. And obviously, if we talk about prisons, we should never forget that it has very much become a business in its own right. And also a place for economic exchange, as we will surely hear from Andrew. But enough said. Andrew, over to you. I'm looking forward to the launch.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to stand so as to reach to the back. It really is an honor to be present here. Thanks, Lutz, for hosting. I mean, maybe it's just opportunism that I end up here, given that you granted me the opportunity. And thanks, Michelle, for agreeing to be discussant. Thanks also to the Danish Foreign Ministry's Research Council, who funded the big project that this emerged out of, and to my colleague Thomas Max Martin, who wrote the foreword. And obviously thanks to my 5 co-authors who are not named with their real names on the cover of the book for their own protection. I wish they were here in person. It was one of my core concerns before the coup, that they would be promoted, that their research would be out there, that they would be known for it. I stand for them, as it were. So, some of you know more than others, but I'm going to start with a little bit of sort of background contextualization. So, February 1st, 2021, a military coup in Myanmar, the military alleging electoral fraud, and those who ruled for the previous few years were basically slung into prison. Laws were changed to serve the military regime's immediate interests. The criminal justice system was quickly weaponized to clamp down on the protests. Young people, old people, all kinds of people flocked to the streets. People in their homes collectively banged on pots and pans, expressing their dissent and enragement at what was going on, mirroring forms of protests that were known in Myanmar for decades, in a manner reminiscent of the way they protested before. Teachers, lawyers, doctors, other professionals came together to form a vibrant civil disobedience movement. These protests at that time, 2021, were met with extreme violence. Gradually, the dynamic of popular protest versus regime crackdown morphed into what some people refer to as a revolutionary situation, with ethnic armed organizations who'd long been engaged in struggles for autonomy or independence, coming together with People's Defense Forces, new armed agencies in what the National Unity Government, which was established as a counterpoint to the usurping military regime, announced as a defensive war. The initial coup was a shock to most people. Few people had seen its coming, and its aftermath is still unfolding today. The Egyptian political scientist scholar Mona El-Gobashi proposes that we look at revolutions not in terms of their historical, grand, world-making significance, but in terms of what she terms unfolding happenings with indeterminate outcomes. Her point of reference is the unanticipated uprising in Egypt in 2011, the development and trajectory of which she characterized as uncertain at every step. And for her, a revolutionary situation is a situation of contested political practice where the system of rule has been fundamentally questioned, but the future is by no means assured. And this seems to me, at least, a fairly accurate portrayal of the situation in Myanmar, at least until more recently perhaps. So the book I'm here to talk about grew out of these circumstances, though the data collection and the data that the book concerns is from before all that played out. It occurred before the coup. So the data is based on people's experience of imprisonment between 2015 and 2019. So it's not a book about the horrendous effects of the crackdown and the treatment of people arrested for resisting and refusing the current military regime. And on that topic, if you're interested in that, I refer you to the fantastic work of the Assistance Association for Political Prisoners, also to a couple of articles I've helped co-write that have been published in a recent journal, or a recent, edition of the journal Justice, Power and Resistance. One of these is about the question of whether prisons serve as incubators or incinerators of political hope, which is a marvelous expression I've stolen from my friend Thomas Max Martin. Another is on the enduring commitment of lawyers supporting detainees within the militarized justice system. So that's on the sort of post-coup experience, if you're interested in that. This particular book is about everyday life in prisons prior to the coup. So in the period, as Lutz alluded to, where the country was in theory democratizing, where human rights were supposedly beginning to be respected, where state institutions were undergoing a certain level of transformation, where talk of imprisonment, in fact, was framed no longer in terms of repression, but in terms of rehabilitation and reform, vocational training of prisoners, better visiting spaces for prisoners, things sponsored by the Red Cross, for example. During that period, the authorities were certainly more open than they have been renowned for being. They were even dialoguing with people like us and opening their doors in pretty controlled fashion, but nevertheless opening some doors. At the same time, of course, the genocidal catastrophe faced by the Rohingya population was playing out. So even amidst the global optimism and the widespread faith, apparent faith in the regime of Aung San Suu Kyi, there was grounds for some skepticism about the promise of transition. So coming back to the book, I've been in two minds, to be honest, about whether to read from the book or to talk about the book. But the book was kind of written to be read. So I want to mix a little bit, and I'll talk a little bit about how the book came to be, and I'll read some small sections just to give you a flavor of how it was written and how we engaged with the data that we worked with. Depending on the time, I'll read a couple of sections about fear, about sleep, about how dormitory cells or wards were organized. But I want to start by talking about the genesis of the book, its production, its co-production, its structure, and some key takeaways, if you like. Might sound a little bit abstract, the key takeaways, but hopefully the readings will sort of illustrate the core arguments. I'm based at an organization called Dignity, where I do academic, increasingly collaborative research work with and through civil society organizations in the Global South. Dignity is a fairly complex hybrid organization. It began as a clinic for tortured refugees who'd got asylum in Denmark, but over the last 40 years or so has sort of transformed into a kind of human rights / development / research organization. Where we pride ourselves in doing academic kinds of research, which is sort of what enables me to stand here in these sort of esteemed corridors. I've worked there for 25 years, actually, since I was a student. And in many ways, I'm a product of Dignity, and I'm a product of the relationships and networks with academics that I've developed over the years, amongst others with Lutz, and now also with Michelle, who I've got to know. So we got money from the Danish Research Council for a project called Legacies of Detention in Myanmar, and we were interested in looking into looking through the lens of imprisonment historically and contemporarily about, so what actually is changing in Myanmar at this time of what everybody was saying was going to be great change. This reflected a long-term interest I've had on studying prisons in the global south ethnographically, often in places of transition, whether it was a transition from sort of dictatorship to democracy in Nigeria, where I did my PhD on prison staff and human rights, or whether it was transition from sort of civil war to fragile peace in Sierra Leone, where I did my postdoc about different forms of confinement there. So this follows on for that interest in what happens to prisons when apparently there is something changing politically. As you may know, the political context in 2015 in Myanmar was, it was fated, it was celebrated, it was paradigmatic of hoped for transition. Things were changing. It was a country that was imagined into being by its leaders and its inhabitants, of course, but also by global discourses about democratic transition. Part of the collaborative study involved, it was a research capacity grant we had. So we were supposed to be building the capacity of people in Myanmar to be able to do the kind of research that we've been doing for some years. So we mentored a small team of people in ethnographic methodologies, in interviewing and all this kind of stuff. And we did a series of case studies, and it was the third case study that led to this particular book. The first one was about prisoners' contact with the outside world, so visits and the impact on families of people being in prison. The second one was a project about gender and imprisonment, how imprisonment is gendered. And the third one led to this. Each of these studies was based on field research conducted by my co-authors that involved qualitative interviews, seeking out the first-person perspectives, people who had the lived experience of incarceration at this time. So a radically collaborative piece of work. The book's based on interviews with 49 former prisoners. So after they'd come out of prison, so where they were actually free to talk about their previous experience. 41 of them were men, a small minority, 8 of them were women. And after the interviews had been conducted, they were translated for my benefit into English, and then we discussed the transcripts. We drowned in the data in multiple fashion. And when it came to the writing, I was the one holding the pen, but in a close sort of collaborative feedback loop, consistent discussion of the sort of conclusions that were being drawn from the data. So what's the book actually about? I think in a nutshell, what it kind of does, given the change in the context with the coup, it explains how it was possible for the military regime to weaponize the criminal justice system so easily in that period after the crackdown. And the short answer to how come that was so easy was because the prisons were pretty problematic beforehand. So what we elsewhere have referred to as the dynamics of patriarchal penal power, they had not actually changed much during the period of transition. Penal practice, it seemed, was a bit impervious to any transformative currents that might have been underway. And maybe those currents were more illusory than people had realized at the time. So the book's about what we call everyday prison governance. And by this, we mean simply the organization and regulation of everyday life. It's a very simple definition. It's not a hyper-theorized definition of governance. How is everyday life organized and regulated? And what effects does it have on people? How do they talk about those experiences? It's kind of unique in the sense that the perspectives are those of ordinary prisoners. A lot has been written over the years about imprisonment in Myanmar, but almost always through the eyes of political prisoners. And it's not that we were not interested in political prisoners, but we were also interested in the voice of everybody else that gets criminalized and thrown into prison in Myanmar. So it's a study essentially of ordinary people who were in prison. So it's about Myanmar prisons, but it also serves as an additional sort of empirical source to push back against the dominant understandings of imprisonment, which are based on studies of Western prisons. The standard narrative about what prisons are and how they operate and function is based on research done in the West, because not much is done in the global South. So this also contributes to that. Following a scholar called Schatz, we adopted an ethnographic sensibility, even though our data was interview data. This is not a deep ethnography. We did not spend ourselves hours and hours observing prison life. But we were attentive to the meaning and the significance and what matters to the people speaking to us through the process. So in that sense, it was informed by an ethnographic sensibility. Schatz argues that you can even approach an archive ethnographically if you get your head in the right space. Yeah, it's divided into a bunch of chapters. Obviously, we cover things like the administrative structure and the rules, so bureaucracy and what we term proxy governance. That's the way the staff basically hand over responsibility for regulation and organization to folk they call tanzis, discipline keepers, or other senior prisoners. There's a chapter about what we call mundane survival and exchange economies. There's a chapter about debasing and sustaining encounters. So in all my research on prisons, it's been very much a focus on the relationships. There's some UK scholarship that suggests that the most important things to people in prisons are relationships, whether they are bad relationships or good relationships. So a relational angle is also what we brought to the data. Then there's a chapter on what we call the emotivity of prison experience, a chapter on the exercise of power, and a concluding chapter which is a bit more discursive, theoretical, problematizing the idea of transition, problematizing, in a sense, the idea of the political prisoner, suggesting that aren't all prisoners actually political in one sense or the other. So, some key takeaways, and then I'll read you a little bit. And I think these takeaways are kind of pulled out, but I've used them on Twitter and stuff like that, as a sort of trying to capture something of like the gist of the whole book. Somewhere we write, Myanmar prisoners were geared more to human degradation than human flourishing, more to social death than political life. So let me read you a little section here, just to give you a flavor. The subheading of this section is called the undermining of voice and threat to language. So one way language is at stake and prisoners' sense of self is undermined is through practices of silencing. On arrival at prison, communication is one way. Prisoners don't talk with staff, they're spoken to, explained one woman. We don't have the chance to talk to the prison staff have to talk to us, we have to reply. That's all. No more complaints, no questions. End of quote. A man who, during the interview, had a pretty angry demeanor described how, together with two other newcomers, he was flogged and beaten when they couldn't get the words out to reply to questions about their charges and what had led them to prison. He described how, out of fear, they'd stammered and stumbled over words. Quote, I mean, we're not stammering literally, but we didn't know how to answer. We're like, when we answered them. It's not that we don't know the answer, he explained further. We were scared, it's our first time. He emphasizes the novelty of the situation, the fear, the threatening way in which they first encountered the people initiating them into prison life. You see, when we enter the prison, this is a quote, they're already waiting for us with canes. We were asked to stand before them and their canes. We were terrified. When we're terrified, we can't speak properly. We were stammering. The inability to speak when confronted by the threat of violence that then results in violence seems like a profound and revealing commentary on prison life. Words are not forthcoming. Silence was evoked, perceived as an excuse for a beating. If you won't speak, we'll beat words out of you. If you try to speak and fail, we'll beat you into silence. That's not a quote, that's an analytical. Not knowing what to say or how to say it, the prisoners are disempowered, cowered into submission, and all this on arrival in the prison. So another highlight, or a takeaway, that the prisons were organized and regulated according to hierarchical, martial norms, where authority was distributed, corporeal, bodily, and fear-inducing. Subjection, brutal, endemic, deliberate. I'm going to read you another little section. So this is from the chapter called The Emotivity of Prison Experience. And maybe I should add, we were not imagining emotions as sort of things that we possess or have. We were looking at emotions as things that are generated by particular contexts. That's why it's about the emotivity of the landscape. So it's not about people's feelings, even though of course they're talking about their feelings, but it's the question for us was, under what conditions are particular feelings generated? So in this chapter we examine the emotivity of Myanmar prisons as articulated in the words and language of former prisoners. By looking at the common expressions of emotion used by former prisoners, we unpack the emotional infrastructure of the prison landscape. And now comes a longer section about fear, where we suggest fear is perhaps the dominant organizing principle of prison governance in Myanmar. Prisoners are afraid. Fear is used as a means to manage the prison population. Myanmar prisons are places of dread where violence is both anticipated and actualized. And here we present some examples of who is afraid in what situations, who uses fear to what ends. A number of former prisoners described being afraid of particular prisoners, for example, of the cruelty of boneheads, the verbally abusive tanzi, the crazy, dangerous prisoners, and bullies. A woman described the fear associated with circumstances where bullying and intimidation were the norm. The bullies would say, "We took some of your food, not all your food. If you complain, we'll take all your food next time." So you can hear it's very gritty. It's very down to earth. It's very sort of basic, but it's not trivial. It matters. These things matter, seriously matter. So under such circumstances, a culture of silence prevailed. Fear informed the tendency not to complain. It was not only boneheads and bullies who induced fear. Bad-tempered staff could also be dangerous. Every prisoner was afraid of staff, reported a prisoner. Everyone was complying with what they ordered. In one prison, we learned that the officer in charge of administration was feared by all prisoners. Recall the tale of the drunken, unpredictable, affronted officer showing up at the prison at night to pick a fight with a prisoner. That's a story we told earlier in the book. Others feared for their health and general well-being, or the humiliating possibility of being escorted to the hospital in foot shackles. Here the fear, as referenced by one prisoner, was as much about the shame and embarrassment of appearing shackled at hospital as it was about the risk to the body of illness or disease. Fear and shame were also mixed for a man who expressed feeling suicidal when entering the prison. He feared to, quote, become a fool and feel like a fool. Fear is associated with what one might become and what one might feel. The defamation of personhood the prison imposes is both felt and has consequences for prisoners' long-term sense of self. For many, the night was a source of discomfort, but also for fear, brought about not by the risk of being trampled on during the night, as much as simply sleeping badly due to congestion. Over a series of a few minutes during one interview, a man returned to this theme repeatedly. "You know, we were very scared. everyone has to be scared, especially at night. Because you know what? We were afraid they might not be able to sleep, we might not be able to sleep properly. Everyone wished the night never comes because we could not sleep. Everyone is scared of the night. I was also very scared, especially at night. I was always scared of the dawn. So, what form of anxiety, we ask ourselves, is expressed in the wish for night not to come? At its most basic, this is an anxiety about sleeping arrangements and the discomfort of the night. But we might imagine an extra layer of meaning folded into this statement. What kind of a state is one in when hoping for the day to remain day in perpetuity, for night never to come? So back to takeaways. I hope this gives you a sort of glimpse into what the book kind of, how it operates, how it works, how it tells its story. You're probably already getting this message. Prisons were harsh, brutal, unfair, unequal, unforgiving. Prisoners are governed through arrangements and relationships of subjugation, embodied coexistence in the shadow of fear, the ever-present threat of violence. Probably not got time to read the other bit, have I? Because you said 20 minutes, and I thought I had 30. So I'll jump to a sort of wrap.
45.
No, read another excerpt. I think they're really compelling. So
You like the excerpts? Okay.
Hear that, yeah.
A little section about ward organisation, which comes quite early in the book, I think. All right. There's even got some diagrams. There's one diagram. Central. So this is about the spatial arrangements. Already spoke a little bit about problems of sleeping. That comes up again also in this section. Central to our discussion of arrangements of space is the juxtaposition of bodies through sleeping arrangements. These arrangements shed important light on aspects of prison governance pertaining to the relations between differentially valued prisoners and to where these relations are upheld and reproduced. So in dormitory-style wards, people's nights are spatially arranged based on status and economic power. One person said, the rich people get 2 people's space for sleeping while others sleep in overcrowded places. Many of the interviews referred to the Buddha shelf or the shrine and the toilet as existing at opposite ends of a spatial spectrum of desirability. It's not necessarily the case that the shrine and the toilet were actually situated at opposite ends of a ward, but the idea of opposites was created by many of the narratives and captured in the drawings made with the former prisoners. So the shrine area was reserved for prisoners with seniority, power, influence or resources, or a combination of these qualities. The area adjacent to the toilet was for the outcast, the newcomer, the foreigner, and prisoners with little access to resources or protection. The opportunity to, quote, lie on your back was highly prized. Many prisoners told bluntly of how sleeping spaces were for sale. Money gave access to the more desirable spaces in the corners or adjacent to walls. A spot near the wall in one specified prison cost 50,000 kyat. Those who couldn't pay would sleep in the middle or near the toilets. The positions closest to the shrine were reserved for the tansi or those he favoured. One man reiterated, a prisoner couldn't lay down without touching another cellmate's body. Prisoners slept close to each other. Rich prisoners had a special bed space. They were not like me. Interesting little sort of positioning. This section too then. A woman who shed tears during the interview and was in prison because of a land dispute said she was forced to sleep near the toilets because of our case. The reference to our case here suggesting she attributes significance to the humiliating sleeping place of her and her co-accused, believing it to be related to the case and to be a punitive act. She also sandwiches a reference to her general suffering in the prison between two almost identical statements of how they had to sleep beside the toilet. When describing the stresses of prison life, she emphasized the sleeping arrangements. The cramped space, overpopulation led to anticipation of nighttime problems. The overpopulated wards are not simply inconvenient, they're tense and harm-inducing. Prisoners expressed anxiety about being trampled on during the night or trampling on others on the way to the toilet, and of the discomfort caused by sleeping in close proximity to others. Agility, self-control, and some discipline are necessitated, as this woman testified. This is a longer quote. There were over 50 prisoners in the room, too many prisoners. Room was 30 feet by 30 feet, where they put so many prisoners. When I went to the toilet at the night, I jumped over other prisoners. Some prisoners also did that. They went over my body. When they went to the toilet, they did it as if they were kung fu or ninja persons. Just kidding. I always trod carefully on the floor to not trample some faces and part of prisoners' bodies. If I stepped on someone, it would cause a fight. A man echoed this sentiment. Even when we walk, we have to be very careful. Otherwise, we might stumble and hurt others. It's crowded. When we sleep, I sleep only for some hours most of the time. Didn't get to sleep well most of the nights because of overcrowding. I was always awake whenever I touched someone. So wrapping, then. A common way to wrap a sort of tragic narrative is with some kind of dramatic, redemptive denouement. It's kind of twist that portrays a heroine or a hero overcoming the odds despite their enormity. This book doesn't have such an ending. In fact, we never aspired to or expected to reach a point where the hard-to-stomach realities of everyday violence and subjugation might somehow become palatable. It was never our desire to dilute or to romanticize the prison experience or disguise its miserly, grimy, or harm-filled reality. On the contrary, our ambition was to dwell with the former inhabitants of Myanmar's prisons on their experiences of everyday prison governance, to get a sense of and a feel for that experience. And one obvious lesson to draw from the analysis, we think, would be to, and this comes from the final sort of more analytic chapter, would be maybe to expect less from times of so-called transition. De-romanticize perhaps the rise of democracy or talk of waves of reform, debunk linear understandings of change. And then the challenge for reformers, and now I'm thinking about my colleagues in the human rights business, would be how to expect less while demanding more. Naivety, good intentions need somehow, we think, to give way to actions that are based on firmly grounded knowledge. The difficulty when it comes to prisons is it's actually quite difficult to get firmly grounded empirical knowledge about institutions that are typically misunderstood and extremely opaque and difficult to access. One final word, which is the final word of the book. Then I will shut up. This book is based on the testimony of persons whose prison experience was in the past. Our hope is that a time will come when this present carceral moment will also be past, that a less punitive, less divided society might emerge, organized and regulated, governed, according to principles of justice and equality, where the politics of survival is replaced with the politics of life in all its fullness. Until then, we hope that this book at least might stand as a gesture of solidarity with people subject to carceral power and a marker of our commitment to put social scientific knowledge to work in pursuit of fairer, more just and less punitive societies. So there I will sit down. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you so much, Andrew. So you did end on a cautious note of hope afterwards. So, right, over to you, Michelle, for your comments and the conversation to come.
Thank you very much, Lutz, and thank you, Andrew, for joining us today. and for sharing with me this book, which I think brings many insights, both to prison life and to some extent to its endemic experience in Myanmar. Legal scholars working in and on Southeast Asia and on Myanmar are generally drawn toward the region's courts and constitutions. Yet, as Melissa Crouch and Tim Lindsay pointed out some time ago now, studying doctrinal law does not tell the full story about how and under what conditions law is imagined, produced, formalized, enforced, reformed, or made meaningful. Nor does it seem, or as it would seem, does it tell the full story of which rules govern some of the most fundamental relationships in society. Or, as the authors of Everyday Prison Governance in Myanmar have put it, the story of how authority is distributed and enacted within prisons, how power is embodied and embedded in mundane social and institutional relations, and how historical relations of penal duress endure, even under conditions of socio-political transformation. The book itself sets up to document the accounts of sex workers, gamblers, thieves, businessmen, farmers, and the occasional activist during a period which now seems one of relative stability in Myanmar from 2015 to 2019, though I know members of the audience may disagree with me, when power was shared, at least at the time, between Aung San Suu Kyi's NLD party and the military. However, what remains striking to me about what the book achieves is the capacity to provide granular detail of the brutality of prison life. In his recent musings on brutalism, Akile Mbembe has framed the idea not in terms of spontaneous, irrational outbursts of violence, but as something rationally conceived. For Mbembe, drawing on the architectural movement of brutalism, it is no mere social construct or something that nature has determined. It is a politics of violence and destruction, but which, like a piece of architecture, is carefully designed, planned, organized, and executed. Similarly, everyday prison governance in Myanmar provides a sense of the duller side of brutality, its execution through social death by 1,000 cuts. The book describes the everyday life of prisoners and their experience of queuing for baths that never really seem to come, mere splashes of water sufficing for washing rituals. The inhumane taunts of being asked to remember your prison number. The paradoxical depths of fear expressed with having to sleep in overcrowded quarters, and yet nevertheless desirous of sleep, and the perceived liberatory act of being able to engage in prison labour outdoors, despite not having earned a cent as it is taken by the prison officers. Like many other sites of incarceration, both historically and across the globe, the lines between those representing the prison's authority and those remaining subservient to it are blurred. Prisoners oversee not only other prisoners, but also the vital bureaucratic functions of the prison. They manage behaviour, they maintain order, they organise work, they receive new prisoners, and they make sure the new prisoners are taught the rules. They instill fear and they extort. This is part of their exercise of authority. Despite being a portrayal of prison life in Myanmar, as a result, there is something strangely familiar about the bureaucratic nature of the extortion, the jibes and emotional turmoil associated with being shamed, the orders to sit, stand, eat, sleep, and the sense that in this quotidian life, the crisis of modernity remains paradoxically contained, yet desolately familiar. This is the dark side of Myanmar, but the routinization remains somehow distinctly revealing of a Benthamite panopticon, itself obsolete thanks to Britain's ability to sustain the significance of orderly extractivism and with the aid sometimes of the Myanmar sun through the Pone san, a stress posture undoubtedly utilised during the colonial period that has been made all the more torturous by these conditions. And while the ward Tanshi is sometimes portrayed as resting on his laurels, the discipline keepers are the ones who are always active. One important insight this brings is that the foundational logics that drive the organisation and regulation of everyday prison life in Myanmar are ideas about who is valued, that is, who and who is not worthy or unworthy. As the book recounts, the value attributed to prisoners affects how their time is organised and where they can sleep. Their perceived worth affects every aspect of prison experience. Value here is not something based upon respect and trust. Prisoners who labour have value even as they are a source of value. But prisoners are also an expense. In that sense, they have both positive and negative value to the prison. I agree with the author that there is no sense of an ending of which we withdraw some redemption from the book. And I think one of the key lessons that I learned or thought of when reading it is maybe as human rights activists and lawyers and scholars, we need to give up on the idea of utopia altogether, to grapple in detail with the realities of society, the extent to which brutalism is entrenched in Myanmar and in many other places in the world and across the globe in our current context. If Hannah Arendt says that evil is somehow banal, I thought one thing I could draw from your book was that the audacity of the human soul is indeed somewhat ordinary and yet prevalent throughout its pages. I thought it was both a granular and important book about an important aspect of Myanmar society for which I had very little knowledge and was grateful to begin a journey of thinking about, but also something which raised as many questions as it did answers about our understanding of prison governance in its contemporary context, both in Myanmar and beyond. And for that I thank you. So the first question to you then, as the discussant, after which point I will of course, turn to more at the floor. From the floor is that one gets a sense from the prison itself that you detail, the prisons that you detail through the eyes of the former imprisoned, is that there's a world within a world here that's undertaken in the prison. And at points there was no real sense for me of time and space outside of the prison itself. And that may be in part because of the wonderful way in which your subjects are in fact discussing what's happening. But I wanted to ask whether you felt there was any reflection of Myanmar society or the extent to which certain routinization or functions revealed that, beyond what you've already said, of course, in your comments. And if not, what then? How does this differ, or what does this study bring to dominant studies undertaken in the West?
Yeah, I mean, thanks very much for your generous reading of the text. Well, thanks for reading it. Thanks for reading it in the fashion that you've understood it so well. In some sense, it's ironic that there is not much more of society in Myanmar, though I would never claim to be a Myanmar scholar in that sense.
And nor would I, for that. Because I know there are many in the room
sneak that
who know
caveat
much more about Myanmar than I do, including
lost the thread already. But because I study prisons in the global south, people often ask me, so, how do our prisons compare to their prisons? What's the worst prison you've ever been in? And I always resist answering those questions. But of course, the comparative project is a valuable project. And I think what stands out to me in the Myanmar context, compared with the West African context that I've looked at quite carefully, is the militarized aspect. And we write quite a lot in, I think it's the last chapter, about the martial features of governance.
Yeah, and the extent to which rules, there is a rules-based order in the prison.
Yeah, but I mean, the rules feature fairly universally in prisons. It's highly bureaucratized here, but there is something about the militarized stuff that I think stands out, and to me clearly is a product of 70, however many years of martial rule, 50, don't quote me on that, 70 years of conflict. 50, so that aspect of sort of Myanmar history definitely seems to sort of spill over into the way that the prisons are peculiarly, excessively sort of militarized.
Right. So it's the and when you say militarized in a Myanmar sense, that's as a result of the last 50 years, you would say, of the manner in which the state.
Yeah, I mean, one of the arguments we've put forward to our human rights colleagues who are committed to sort of monitoring places of detention, you know, these models of trying to improve carceral conditions through scrutiny and monitoring. And sometimes, from my perspective, it becomes a bit of a checkbox exercise, and it becomes a bit of an exercise where it's sort of, it's about compliance to norms that are often generated from the West. And we've argued very strongly that one should take prisons' histories more seriously. We should take prisons' relationship to the surrounding society more seriously, the interactions that go on, the porosity of the walls, rather than the sort of distinctiveness or the separateness of prisons from society. We've probably actually not done that as well as we could have done in this particular book, because we dive into the narratives of the former prisoners, so it is quite an internal narrative. Yeah. So I take your point on that.
Yeah, but I think it's a good point that you raise, and also the relationality of the situation for the prisoners in prison and outside of the prison was not really the subject of this particular text. But
we've done that in our prisoners' contact with the outside world, and we looked at the gendered aspects in other work too. So yeah.
Yeah, that was my other question. So obviously you're doing it in other projects, but how does gender play? To some extent that comes out in the book. You did talk about the unique experience of women prisoners and the ways in which they understood both what the routinization of violence was and how it operated. And one of the biggest fears for one of the female prisoners was queuing, or that was a concern for her, queuing, because that in effect meant that, you know, she was waiting for various services. I think it was at the time she was queuing to have a bath, a bathroom, and you know, she knew that she had to do that in a certain order or face consequences.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to overstate this or overgeneralize either, since it's 8 women's narratives that we had, and most of them were for land disputes, and they were connected, and they came for one prison. I don't know if I mentioned that there were 4 prisoners that were sort of featured, former prisoners from 4 different prisons, of different types of prisons. But there was a sort of qualitative sense that women's experience of prison was different from men's experiences of prisons. That they were not facing the same forms of brutality and subjugation. They were saddened and upset, and they used those kind of words rather than brutalized and humiliated. So sometimes I forget what the data in this book is, and remember data I've been analysing more recently. This might actually be a more recent story, where... No, I don't want to tell that story, because it's try me with another question.
Sure. I mean, I'm happy also to open it up to the floor, because I'm aware that we've been speaking now for an hour, and I'm aware of people having their own interests or questions to ask. So perhaps if I